Hey there, it's Silver. This is Remnant II. So yeah, the sequel to Remnant from the Ashes, and overall this game reminds me a lot of something like The Surge 2, whereas the first Surge was a very flawed game that had, it was basically a good proof of concept for making a Souls-like in a bit of a different form, and I feel that that's also the case for the first Remnant. It was a flawed game, but it had a lot of interesting ideas. And then the developers took a whole bunch of stuff they learned from actually putting out that original game, and coming up with a sequel that was basically better in every way, and that's very much what The Surge 2 was like, and that's exactly what Remnant 2 is like as well. It is Remnant, but more, but expanded in every direction. It's just a sequel with more of everything, more variety, more loot, more places, more enemies, more polish. Everything about it is enhanced. The way it works is, well, it's a third-person shooter, but it is, of course, also a Souls-like, and it does actually, in my opinion at least, use those mechanics pretty well, and there are also certain things that it doesn't do, which is interesting. Like, for instance, there's no death penalty in this game. Dying does not lose you anything, aside from progress, I guess, or wherever you were. You'll go back to a checkpoint, of course, but other than that, you won't lose anything and have to go back and get it, which I think is fine. I mean, it works just fine in this game to not have a penalty like that, and considering how exploration-heavy in general this game is, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing either. I don't mind that as a change to the usual mechanic. I think it works fine. The general structure is this. You'll be in a world. There are several different worlds to go through, and each world will consist of usually 2 or 3 big, huge open areas that are separated by load screens. So it's not like a fully open world kind of thing. There are load screens, but the main areas are very large. And within these large areas, there will of course be paths that you have to take in order to actually progress the story, usually a dungeon of some kind that you've got to find to get a particular key item you need, or the path to the next of the open areas that will eventually lead you to the final boss of that area. But also within these big open areas will be all kinds of other stuff to do and find, from just little secrets hidden around the place and puzzles to solve, as well as a ton of other dungeons, small dungeons that are not story critical. You can do them whenever you want, or skip them entirely if you wish, but I do recommend doing them because they're fun. And there are just a load of these dungeons and other various bits of side content and little side quests you can do and all sorts of things like that. And then of course once you're sort of done with one of those large hub areas, you'll move on to the next hub area of that world, and again it'll have a whole bunch of side stuff, some dungeons, and eventually a main questline bit. And once you're done with all 2 or 3 of these big hubs, you will face the final boss of that world, get a key item, and then you will then move on to the next world. So this is a linear game, but it is a very open linear game where you can pretty much backtrack at any point you wish to, and you do have full free fast travel, that was a hard thing to say, between all of the checkpoints you find. Well, most of them I should say. There are 2 kinds of checkpoint in this game. There are these little crystals on the ground and these big floating crystals. The big floating crystals are your major checkpoints. Just, go to these and everything gets restored, all the enemies respawn, all that usual stuff, and you can fast travel from these to any other big crystal in the game. So these are your main fast travel points. But these small crystals, they do all the usual stuff like restoring you back to full health and restoring all of your charges of things and respawning to enemies and stuff, but you cannot fast travel to them. You can fast travel from them, but only to the main hub safe area of the game, your Firelink Shrine. The area that you go back to with all the NPCs and stuff like that, you can only go to there from these. So they're a lot more limited in terms of your travel, and these are usually found like mid-dungeon or something like that, whereas the big crystals are found in much more important areas that you might want to actually go back to, like the beginning of dungeons or the middle of the big hubs. You've got 3 different weapon slots, 2 firearm slots, this is a very ranged focus game, and a melee weapon slot. This is actually one change from the original Remnant. They've made melee a lot more viable in this game. There were specific builds in the first Remnant that were pretty viable for melee, but they were really specific, like you had to have a really certain combination of things, whereas in this game I feel that melee weapons in general are just better. They have a light combo as well as heavy attacks that can be charged to do extra damage, but of course they take a lot of your stamina and they take quite a bit of time to wind up, and there are all kinds of different melee weapons you can find, including some that have some ranged options. I'm a really big fan of the Huntress Spear, which you'll see in the background a lot, which is just a nice pokey stick spear for general melee usage, but also instead of a strong attack, you throw it, so it's got some range to it, and it can even get like headshots and stuff and do a lot of damage, but is of course quite slow to prepare for a throw, so you can't spam it. But your other two slots, your main weapons, are of course your sort of long gun slot and your handgun slot. And the long gun, as it's called, can be almost anything really. It can be like rifles, machine guns, bows, even some other stuff like that. There are a lot of different weapons in this game, and a lot of them are quite creative and strange in a lot of ways, but more on that in a few. And your pistol slot is generally a pistol, but there are some other things with faster fire rates and some other more advanced and strange things you can find as well. So there's plenty of exotic options, even though most of your weapons are guns. Few of them are like authentic, realistic guns. Most of them are very odd in different ways, lots of alien weaponry and stuff that works in some pretty strange ways. Weapons can also have mods attached to them. These mods are new attacks, actually. They're not passive, they are active attacks. And you charge them up by doing damage with that weapon, and then once they're charged, you can activate the mod. Every weapon has a mod slot, and there are all kinds of mods you can find and craft. Bosses do drop materials of various kinds, and you can take these boss materials back to the hub, the main save hub, and craft new mods and sometimes new weapons. And this is actually where a bit of like an Elden Ring comparison comes in, believe it or not, because the way that it works is you could consider these mods kind of like weapon arts or Ashes of War and something like Elden Ring, and you'll find that your more general, not as fancy exotic weapons have free mod slots, and you can craft a mod and plop it in that slot and have whatever you want. But there are also boss weapons, weapons that you can only obtain from boss materials. These have their own exclusive mods that are already attached and can't be removed and replaced with something else. Very much like how, you know, a boss weapon in Elden Ring will have its own Ash of War that you can only get on that and can't be replaced with something else. It's basically that kind of idea. There are also these things you'll start finding later called mutators that can be added onto weapons in their own slots, and mutators are just something that alters how they work in some way. Like you might have one that makes it to where every time you pick up ammo for that particular weapon, it will increase its damage by a good percentage for a few seconds. So things like that. They are passive increases to how a weapon works in some way, and there are lots of those to find as well. So overall, you have a lot of weapon variety in this game, and like I mentioned, a lot of them are really weird and crazy. I like the fact that weapons that can have mods attached to them will actually change their models if you attach a mod. Like attaching a mod to a weapon that doesn't have one will actually alter its aesthetics, which is a cool touch. But yeah, the creativity on display here with a lot of the weapons is kind of out of the park. They've done a really good job. You've got crazy cuboid guns that fire bullets that actually return to you and can only be fired one at a time, so you have to wait for them to come back to you before you can shoot them again, to a weird starburst pistol thing that can build up charges for a big, huge explosive shot, to my favorite weapon so far, which is the Deceit rifle that you'll see a lot in the background. It is a sort of dual shot rifle that fires two beams, one above the other, that pierce enemies, and these are actually like shards of light that the weapon creates. It doesn't actually fire anything from a barrel. Instead, these shards of light sort of float around the barrel and then fling off at high speed. It's very high damage, but it can't get any weak point hits, so getting like headshots and stuff doesn't do any more damage than normal. But in exchange, its weapon mod causes you to generate a bunch of blades of light around you, and then whenever you attack with your melee weapon, it flings off one of these blades that does damage and marks an enemy with a debuff. And while they have this debuff on them, your Deceit shots will always be crits, as if you were hitting headshots and stuff no matter where you hit them. So it goes from never getting them to always getting them for a few seconds, which makes it extremely powerful burst damage with a little bit of setup time. So yeah, they've definitely done a really good job making some creative and interesting weapons, and I'm really only scratching the surface here with what I'm talking about. There's some really cool stuff in this game that you can find, and every time you beat a new boss, you immediately want to go back home and see what you can make from it, because a lot of the stuff is really cool. You've also got a class, and the class gives you a specific trait, which is a passive effect that will increase over time as you level up the class. You just get experience from killing enemies with that class equipped. But each class also has an active ability. Actually, they have 3, but you can only choose one at a time, and as you level up, you'll get more and more of those 3 abilities, so you can choose whichever one you want. And you can equip up to 2 classes at once. So this means your overall combat variety is kind of huge, because you've got your weapons, all 3 of them, you've got your weapon mods, you've got your class abilities to each, and all the various passive benefits and things that stack up from how your classes work. So there's a lot of cooldowns and stuff to manage in this game. There's a lot going on in the combat, and it makes for a really satisfying gameplay loop where the combat is really genuinely great. You've also got armor slots that you can equip in various different ways, of course, and you've got 4 ring slots and 1 amulet slot that tend to have all sorts of very powerful effects, and you've also got a relic slot. So imagine if in something like Dark Souls, the Estus flask could be switched out for a different kind of flask that still healed you but did something else. That's basically what relics are. Relics are your charge-based healing item that refreshes every time you go to a checkpoint, but they all do something different. The one you start with is just your basic vanilla heal, right? Just a burst of healing, but you'll find others that do all sorts of other things. Like one, for instance, that doesn't actually heal you by default, but instead gives you a ton of lifesteal on all of your attacks for several seconds, allowing you to regenerate your own health by doing damage. Or the one that I'm currently using, I believe, is called the Crystal Heart, which is sort of like a 100% health gauge heal. It's a full health gauge worth of healing, but it happens over 10 seconds, and it slows you down to a crawl while it's happening, but it can't be interrupted. Once it starts, it will continue to heal you through damage and stuff. So it's a very powerful heal with a cost. And I think the system is really cool. I think having various different forms of healing item adds a lot of extra build variety, because this is a pretty major part of your moveset, right? Your ability to heal yourself. So having different forms that it can take is interesting, I think. But I think, honestly, of all the things to say about the game, even though I really enjoy its combat, and I think its combat is a very high point, I think the thing it does the best is its exploration and its reward structure. So this is something that a lot of Souls-likes have trouble with, because in Dark Souls, every piece of loot is something you want. Every time you see a little glowing item somewhere, you want to get up to it. No matter what you got to do, you want to see what it is, because Dark Souls hammers into you from a very early stage, all loot is useful. It could be souls to help you level yourself up. It could be upgrade materials to make your weapon stronger. It could be new weapons, new armor sets, new spells. Dark Souls has a ton of stuff to reward you with that's all really meaningful loot. You don't get tiny, small, inconsequential things. You get meaningful stuff. And this game does a really good job of doing that. There are loads of rings and amulets that you'll find with all sorts of powerful effects. You could come across a new creative weapon you can only get in a really specific way. You could complete a side quest and get a new relic, an entirely new way to heal yourself. You could even get engrams, which allow you to unlock new classes, because although you start with several classes, those aren't all of the classes in the game, and there are loads of secret ones that you can unlock and level up separately, like the Alchemist or the Summoner, for instance. So this game has a really fantastic reward structure and really good exploration, because the hub areas are so large and have so many things to find, as well as all these various side dungeons and things you can find, and oftentimes these areas and dungeons have optional bosses for you to fight that drop unique materials that, increase your build variety even further by giving you access to new mods and weapons you wouldn't otherwise have found, and some other things like that. So yeah, this game is really good at making you want to explore by giving you a ton of meaningful and interesting treasure to find all over the place. And the game is also really good at puzzles, by the way. Something I didn't expect was how involved some of the puzzles get in this game. There are some really involved puzzles that took me like over half an hour to figure out what they actually wanted from me, but I was always able to figure them out without like Googling them or anything, which in my opinion is indicative of good puzzle design. If nothing is so cryptic that I don't understand what you even want, but it still takes me a little bit to figure it out, that's, I think, a good design for a puzzle, and this game is full of those. You'll sometimes find entire side dungeons that are all one big puzzle with several different powerful rewards as you solve it. So what that means in total is that this game has a really satisfying gameplay loop with really awesome combat interspersed with very excellent exploration and super interesting areas with a lot of very cool loot to find. I should also mention the overall graphical look and design of the worlds is very good. The worlds look super cool, and some of them have some very creative and interesting designs, like for instance the final boss room of the first world you'll start in, which is a world of Fae, Fae folk. So there's all sorts of otherworldly crazy stuff happening there, and the final boss is actually 2 different people who are kind of just reflections of the same person, because Fae, that's just how it works. And you'll notice that the bottom of the floor, basically, of the boss room is extremely glossy glass, so it should be reflecting the boss fight, but instead it's reflecting the other boss that you're not fighting at the time, so you see both of the reflections of this character at once. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say really creative visual design. There's some really striking design to a lot of the worlds in this game, and I found that each of them I've visited so far have been really fun to explore, and I've also had some really sweet set pieces of like huge temples and giant statues and crazy buildings and really weird puzzles and odd side content to achieve. Things that you might not expect will actually give you a reward, but you just try it and see if you can do it anyway, and it turns out it actually is something, like repairing an ancient generator to start up an ancient machine to find these sarcophagi that end up giving you special weapons and stuff as you open them up. A really like multi-layered process like that you might not fully understand what you're doing until the end of it, and you realize you've just completed a side quest just by wandering around. So yeah, I think overall it's a fantastic package and is absolutely worth the money, and is a very, very good Souls-like that manages to go off in its own direction and not feel derivative of Dark Souls in a way like it owes something to it, like it has to do things similar to it. Rather, it has a lot of its own ideas that it very comfortably grows into and creates something unique. There is, of course, one downside to talk about, which is the performance. I've found, personally, the performance to be okay for me. That doesn't mean that it will be okay for you, because unfortunately the performance, while it's alright, in my opinion, it's really inconsistent is the problem. It's not that it's like overall bad in certain areas, it's that it can just vary wildly from world to world, exactly how it performs, which is weird. Like, for instance, there's a world called Yeisha, which is a very lush world with swamps and forests and huge trees, tons of foliage and leaves and plants everywhere. It's a very visually detailed world, and it runs like flawlessly. It runs perfect. But then you have a world like Nerud, which is like a desert wasteland where there's not a whole lot visually going on. It's just a lot of like dust and cliffs and no like foliage or anything to render. And for some reason that one runs worse. Even though it's a lot more visually simplistic, it doesn't run as well, and I don't understand why that is. So there's definitely something going on with the overall optimization of this game where certain areas just don't run as well as they should in comparison to other areas. So I do have to say that regardless of how the performance has been for me personally, your mileage may vary on how it works for you, because it has been shown to be quite inconsistent at times. But if you can get past that inconsistency and get some good performance, this is an absolutely fantastic game, and is one of the rare few games that I'm going to be going back to a lot after I've already covered it to continue to play more of it. That's not something that I do as often as I'd like, and in the case of this game, I am absolutely going to, because it is that good, and is something that I would be very glad to see eventually some DLC for in the future, a bit of an expansion, you know what I mean? That would be pretty cool. Maybe it'll sell good enough for that, hopefully, who knows. But anyway, I'll link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Remnant 2 so you can check it out for yourself. Highly recommend it if you're at all a fan of Souls-likes or action RPGs or just third-person shooters in general. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.